I was the associate rabbi of Temple Israel of Hollywood, on Hollywood Boulevard, about 4 blocks from Hollywood and Vine. A synagogue that's been around since the 1920s and had a lot of great people in its day. Marilyn Monroe used to take conversion classes there when she was marrying Arthur Miller. Sammy Davis Jr. was converted there.
Wow.
And then in my time, we had people like Mayim Bialik was a member of the congregation. She would sound the shofar.
All right. Welcome to the Houston Ensemble podcast. Today we have a wonderful guest. We are joined by Rabbi Edwin Goldberg. Thank you so much for coming. It is an honor. I wanted to specifically have a rabbi on because we just haven't yet. Armin and I are both really interested in culture, religion, different religions than our own. We're also interested in expert opinion, and you would be an expert in that. And Rabbi Goldberg is of the Houston Rabbinical Association. And I thought, where better to speak to somebody than that? So Rabbi Goldberg, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Thank you for coming to the house. I know, as I said, it can almost be a little weird when I'm saying you're going to come over to the house, but this is where the setup is.
During the pandemic, I think we all got used to wherever we work is where we work.
Yeah. Maybe we can start with, for people who are watching this, who don't know who you are yet, maybe even live in Houston, could you kind of tell them what you currently do and how you got involved in the Rabbinical Association?
Sure. I'm starting my 4th year as a rabbi in the Houston area. I'm actually the rabbi of Congregation Beth Shalom up in the Woodlands. And I love what I do. I've been a rabbi since 1989, and I've served in pulpits in Cincinnati, Ohio, and also in Miami and Los Angeles, Chicago, and now here. We also have in Houston a wonderful group of rabbis of Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, all the different spectrum. And there's about 30 of us, even more on the list, but about 30 that show up for our meetings. And I am the president. It's a volunteer job where I just get to organize and make sure we're all working together to support the community and get support from other agencies in the community. So I'm delighted to do it. Even though I'm pretty new here, I was so grateful during the pandemic, the way that the Houston Rabbinical Organization met every week on Zoom and really gave what we call in Hebrew chizuk, or strength, to those of us who are doing new kind of work, mostly in the technological department that we weren't used to. So that was great.
It is widely known that the tobacco and diet industries lobby governments with scientific propaganda for years until proven guilty in court. The artificial treatment of our water is the next corporate deception.
For example, virtually every nation in Europe has rejected the use of artificial fluoride. International studies since the 40s have repeatedly shown that endocrine and neurological effects increase after repeated consumption, even at the levels accepted by U.S. government.
Epic Water Filters is the most thorough industry-grade filtration system that Houston Ensemble has ever used. They reduce heavy metals upwards of 99.5%, such as lead and mercury, bacteria like E. coli, and poisons like chromium, nitrate, and fluoride.
Join us in our journey to living a toxin-free life and get your Epic Water Filter using discount code Houston Ensemble, lowercase, one word. That's Houston Ensemble, lowercase, one word, for 20% off your Epic Water Filter.
So, real quick, I know we mentioned this on the phone, but since we're in the podcast, you were in Cincinnati at a point. Can you talk to us, which is where I'm from, for people who don't know, talk to us about what you did in Cincinnati.
So Cincinnati is the birthplace of the seminary of Reform Judaism in this country. By that, I mean the first Reform rabbi in this country, Isaac Mayer Wise, came to Cincinnati in the 1850s. And in the 1870s, he opened up a seminary for rabbis called the Hebrew Union College. And so in 1987, I went there to finish my rabbinical trainings, having also trained in or been educated in Jerusalem and Los Angeles. After 2 years, I stayed, and I was the assistant rabbi of the largest congregation in Cincinnati, the same congregation that Rabbi Wise had served as a rabbi in the 19th century. So I was there for 5 years. And I've been back many times for different conventions. Unfortunately, that particular seminary campus is not going to stay open for the rabbinical program that was just announced about 3 months ago. And many of us are pretty depressed about that. There's also campuses in New York and Los Angeles, as well as Jerusalem. And in this case, the coast just had more drawing power. So, but I love Cincinnati. I love, there's a great bread place. I even love the chili. I love the ice cream, Grater's ice cream.
Yeah.
And the people are wonderful.
What about, did you ever, so where was this place in Cincinnati? What part of the city?
So the seminary is in a place called Clifton.
It was in Clifton?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's right in the city, very close. In fact, when I would walk home every day, I'd walk through the University of Cincinnati campus, and I took some classes there as well. I was never going to be a psychologist, but I was trained for a year in doing therapy, kind of thing where there's someone watching on a camera. So if I say something really stupid, they'll come in and tell the person, don't listen to him. He doesn't know what he's talking about. That never happened, but it was a great opportunity to try out some counseling skills.
Would you say that Cincinnati, and I feel like I don't actually know this too well personally, would you say that Cincinnati has a large Jewish heritage?
Very large Jewish heritage. Not so many Jews there anymore.
Okay.
But again, when Isaac Mayer Wise went there in the 1850s, he was really a dreamer, a visionary, a builder, and there was not much there. There was another synagogue, but he was able to start a new synagogue shortly thereafter, right after the Civil War, in fact, built a beautiful building, which is still in use as the synagogue as the temple for the synagogue. It's called the Plum Street Temple. It's on Plum Street in downtown, 4th and Plum or 5th and Plum. And the synagogue, which is now named for him, Isaac Mayer Wise Synagogue, has a wonderful building in the suburbs, but they've maintained this as well. And it's in great condition, and many services are there. In fact, that's where rabbis are ordained as rabbis, at least until now.
Wow. When I go back there in November, I'm going to go down there and think about this and check that out, because I know I've seen that name down there. But, if I don't have a connection.
Well, here you should go to Mount Adams, too. I don't know if you ever go to Mount Adams.
Yeah.
We used to go every year for the Beaujolais Nouveau Festival in November. But there's an interesting story. Isaac Mayer Wise didn't want to create a Reform Judaism, a liberal Judaism. He wanted to create the entire Judaism for America. And in 1883, the first graduating ordination class of rabbis, 4 rabbis, was to be celebrated. And Isaac Mayer Wise invited all the rabbis and Jewish dignitaries in the country, including more traditional ones. And they had a banquet dinner on Mount Adams, this beautiful part of Cincinnati. And they served all the kinds of foods that Jews traditionally don't eat. I mean, there was no pork, but there was clams, there was shrimp. And many of the rabbis walked out in anger and never gave Isaac Mayer Wise the time of day again. So the question's always been, was this a mistake? Was it done on purpose? The Hebrew word for not kosher is treifa. So it's called the treifa banquet. It's one of those things that had it not happened, maybe the Jewish community in this country would look very different.
We've had so many different people on, and obviously we want to know a lot about what you do, but it also would be interesting to get your perspective on no one in particular that we're going to name, but these concepts that we've been exposed to. For example, I'm going to refer to some of our recent podcasts. Like, for example, we had one very recently with a minister of Satan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We also had one right before that with one of the heads of the Gnostic church, Ryan Scroggins, who's also, I believe I'm allowed to say, Scottish Rite Freemason. I mean, he posted it on Facebook, so I guess it's public knowledge now. He's a 32 degree Scottish Rite Freemason, head of Gnostic church. He's also involved in the Kemetic Orthodoxy. So I don't even know where to begin, but let me just pose this question to you. Start a little meta, maybe. Let's see how interesting we can get. There's a point where Chad asked the minister of Satan if she loves all people. And she pretty quickly said, no, I do not. And I guess our perspective is, to make it simple, we want to say that we do love all people. Even, let's say, someone really terrible, a murderer. We love him in that we don't want to abuse him. But it's not that we appreciate or condone what he's doing. Does that make sense a little bit?
It does, especially this time of year when the Jewish high holy days are coming up. Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Judgment, it's called as well. The Day of the Shofar Blast is this Sunday night and Monday. There's a lot of talk about forgiveness, but also accountability. In fact, there's a brand new book that just came out a week ago today called Repentance and Repair by Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. And it's all about how in Jewish tradition, as it's developed, we don't want people to not feel there's a way back to healing. We don't want people to feel like they can't be sorry for what they did. But what we don't believe in is lack of accountability. So if I do something to you that's bad and 2 seconds later I say, please forgive me, I didn't mean it, it feels weird.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm starting a class tonight at my synagogue on a Jewish understanding of the New Testament. I think it's important for Jews who have friends and family who are Christian to understand the New Testament, that the covenant, as the word testament means, that their friends have. And most Jews don't know anything about it.
That word covenant, is it? Am I right in saying that it's related sort of to the word contract? Like an
Exactly.
agreement, right?
When you say contract, people think often, well, it's a legal thing. Worst comes to worst, I'll break it and we'll have some damages. When you say the word covenant, people get a lot more nervous about breaking it. And this happened to me in Cincinnati when I was assistant rabbi. And my senior rabbi at the time said to parents of B'nai Mitzvah kids, you guys have to sign a covenant that these kids are going to continue after B'nai Mitzvah. And there was one dad who said, I'm not signing that. I'll sign a contract. But I'm not signing a covenant because, that's too serious.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's almost like tied to his soul a little bit.
What is Ark of the Covenant?
So the Ark of the Covenant is, in Jewish tradition, going back to the Bible, the Torah, which was in this case not the 5 books of Moses, but simply the 10 commandments on 2 tablets. There was shattered tablets because some bad things happened and Moses shattered them. And then there were the non-shattered, the second ones. In any case, they were kept in a traveling box called an ark. And since it was representing the covenant, this 10 commandments, or the Torah in general, is the if you will, the contract between God and the Jewish people. So all we know is at some point, the ark, which had been in the first temple in Jerusalem, but even then had some magical powers, when they were taking it to Jerusalem after David had become the king in Jerusalem, there was a well-meaning person who touched the ark because it was about to slip. It was being carried by animals, and he was zapped to death. He wasn't a bad person. He was actually trying to do the right thing. But, as the Indiana Jones movie says, when it's the power of God, you got to be very careful. So that's the Ark of the Covenant, which, of course, was considered lost, and that's why we have a great movie about it.
For our viewers, can you kind of describe the Ark and what the parameters were of the covenant?
So as far as the Ark goes, Exodus, the book of Exodus, has a lot of detail. The Torah is not known for having a lot of detail except when it does. It's not like Greek literature where you'll have 5 pages talking about the scar of Odysseus. The Torah is much more terse in its language, but goes into great detail, and it tells us what the ark will be and how it's laden with gold and all sorts of things. So we know that much. As far as what's in it, it's the 10 commandments, but it really symbolizes all of Jewish literature that binds us to God.
Is it true? Obviously, I'm not an expert on this stuff. I just read a bunch of stuff here and there, and I could be wrong, but I remember reading something along the lines of that there's even more ancient mythology wherein it is believed that the Ark could have been found potentially in the tomb of Solomon.
So the Ark would have been in the Temple of Solomon.
Temple of Solomon.
Right. And so what happened to it depends on who you ask. But it certainly would have been around then. Yeah. By the way, it sounds like so long ago, but when you go visit Egypt, or even if you're never been to Egypt, if you visit, sometimes they'll have the traveling King Tut exhibit.
Mhm.
You'll see a little, baby chair of Pharaoh, which is older than anything in the Bible. We tend to think of the Bible's the oldest thing out there,
Right.
but it's not. It's actually pretty new compared
Right.
to
Oh, yeah.
many centuries before.
Yeah. And what was it like for you growing up? I'm assuming you were born into a Jewish family.
Mhm.
And so it was obviously instilled in you in a sense. Like if I grew up Christian and I was born into a Christian family. But what was it that made you actually want to pursue the path of becoming a rabbi and really, really following through?
It's a great question. It's a little complicated. Partly, I think it was simply I grew up in a very large Reformed temple in Kansas City. And some of the things I didn't like, I think I would have liked being in a smaller one. But some of the pageantry I loved. When I was 3 years old, the synagogue celebrated its 100th birthday. And there was a big musical theater production. And someone, not the actual rabbi, but dressed as the rabbi in a clerical robe, at one point put up his hands as if he was doing the priestly blessing. And I remember turning to my dad and said, "That's cool. I want to do that."
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that really marked me, I think, growing up is my father's family comes from America, since the 1860s. But my mother was a refugee from Germany. In fact, it's very hot this week because Ken Burns has a new documentary about how America kept Jews from coming to this country to escape not the Nazis. And my mom was one of them. Was on a ship and turned back from Cuba and then Miami Beach and forced to go back to Europe. So I think a lot of it has to do with feeling that the Jewish people need to be taken care of, not just their body, but also their soul, because we had such a terrible disaster not that long ago. And I might feel a little survivor's guilt too, which is, not rational. But my mom should have ended up in a concentration camp. And the fact that she didn't does make me want to feel like I need to serve.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
you're good.
There was a point where you held your hands up, referring to rabbinical practice. Is it true that this is a rabbinical symbol?
So what? Yeah, this is not rabbinical. It's actually priestly. And this is a meta moment for me.
Mm-hmm.
On Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, when I was a rabbi in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, I was told by my senior rabbi I had to give a blessing, and I had to do this with the hands like this.
Mm-hmm.
That's weird enough.
Yeah.
But invariably, in the 3 years I was there, every single year in the third or fourth row was Leonard Nimoy.
Wow.
So I was doing the Vulcan thing in front of Mr. Spock.
That's so
and he was
funny.
very sweet about it. But most likely, Leonard got it, in the second year of the show, he was meeting another Vulcan and how do Vulcans greet each other,
Mhm.
probably not hugging it out or
Right.
handshake. And so he grew up with this, and it was something he could take from his past.
Do you know what the origins are of that symbol? What it refers to? Why is it called Why did he choose Vulcan?
Oh, no, that was
To
just the
describe-
script
that was
writers.
the script writer,
that was
right.
before his time. But
Right.
But the origin of why the priests do it,
Right.
there's a theory that it's the kind of thing that not everyone can do. Only certain people can do. And
Hmm.
people with that genetic marker can do it.
Oh.
I'm not
Is
just
that-
saying that's true. But
I was going to say, do you think that is like legitimate?
no,
Okay.
because I think most people can do this.
Yeah.
I remember learning that for the first time when I was really young. I was like, how do I do it? And then I did have a click and I was like, okay, there it is. Yeah, that's so interesting that you were doing that in front of him
Yeah.
in Hollywood.
Right.
But for an actual reason.
Where were you that you said you did
I
that?
was the associate rabbi of Temple Israel Hollywood, on Hollywood Boulevard, about 4 blocks from Hollywood and Vine.
Mhm.
A synagogue that's been around since the 1920s,
Yeah.
and had a lot of great people in its day. Marilyn Monroe used to take conversion classes there when she was marrying Arthur Miller. Sammy Davis Jr. was converted there.
Wow.
And then in my time, we had people like Mayim Bialik was a member of the congregation. She would sound the shofar.
So Sammy Davis was a converted Jew?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I did not know that. Is this the building? I just typed in Hollywood Synagogue.
No, that's Wilshire Boulevard, which
Wilshire.
is the really big one.
Okay.
But if you go to the, I don't see it on here. It's trying to remember the address. It's been a long time. Maybe 7200 Hollywood Boulevard. Try that. You say just Temple Israel
That sounds
Hollywood, it
right.
should come up.
I have seen this temple.
Temple Israel Hollywood.
Oh, there's it. No.
I lived in LA for 5 years.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Which one is it?
No, I thought maybe it was that one, but I think that's Wilshire Boulevard.
Images Hollywood.
LWIL. Shire.
Anyway, it's quite a
Just
place.
Wow. Well, all right.
That's it right there. You're pointing to it. That's Temple Israel.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool. Very interesting. So how did what brought you to Hollywood?
So I'd been a rabbi in Cincinnati,
Mhm.
and then I decided I needed to study a lot more because I just didn't know that much. So
Okay.
I went back to Israel for a year and studied just in Hebrew, many classes, and then I needed a job. And I interviewed at different places, and I really fell in love with this community. And so I was there for 3 years, Los Angeles. It was great because a lot of our family was there at the time too.
Mhm.
Wow. What was maybe one of your, let's do a couple things. What had the largest impact on you, maybe in a good spiritual way? And then what was maybe most shocking to you in potentially a not positive way
We're talking about when I was in Los Angeles?
when you're in Los Angeles?
It's a great question. So I think the best part was this was a community that had a lot of wonderful people, a lot of creative people.
Mhm.
It wasn't just actors and actresses, but a lot of the people who produced the shows, the showrunners, things like that. And that kind of energy was great.
Mhm.
One day, a vice president of Warner Brothers, who was also a very active young congregant, who's maybe 30 or something, wonderful guy, took me to a day at Warner Brothers, and we ate lunch at the commissary. He showed me all sorts of interesting things. I love the fact that he showed me where they mix sound for movies in a big theater. And I said, why would you waste an entire theater for two guys mixing? And he said, well, where do you think people are going to hear the sound?
Yeah. Yeah.
But then as we were walking somewhere, two people came up to him and he talked to them and was very friendly. And then I said to him, who were they? And he looked at me without a tinge of irony and said, oh, they're nobodies. And that's the problem with Los Angeles.
Wow.
Everyone's nice, but there's this ranking that makes you feel like you're back in the worst part of high school.
Yeah, I've tried to. I talk about that same thing myself.
That's very interesting.
Well, that comes from the competitive nature of Hollywood, right?
Yeah.
So everyone goes in there because they're not going to say it, but they want to dominate what's going on, whatever field they're in, right?
Right. It's sort of like, Game of Thrones. People are nice, but they're all in it for themselves.
Right.
Mhm.
It's kind of sad.
Yeah. Wow.
Do you
What about? Sorry.
Yeah, no, you go.
What about the term? I'm so interested in etymology, and in college, I took a Jewish history course, a couple of Jewish history courses.
Which college you go to?
I went. My undergrad was at USC.
USC.
Yes.
You mean Southern California?
Southern California.
That's where my kids both went. I'm a huge Trojan
Fantastic.
fan.
Fantastic.
Good time to be a
Mm.
Trojan fan.
Yes, sir. Obviously.
Actually, you probably knew your professor because the professors for the Judaic studies were at my seminary, Hebrew Union College.
That's okay. So you need to remind me what his name was because this was around 2014 or 13.
Maybe Reuven. Yeah, great, brilliant, especially with Islamic studies.
Yes. And
Wow.
what?
Reuven, I forgot his last name.
That was definitely Reuben. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm. That's great. I was literally trying to remember his name for the past month.
Well, we spent a year in Israel together. That year I talked about, it was my third year in Israel, but it was my year postgraduate. And his wife,
Yeah.
Ruth, and I were in the program together. So I'd see Reuven a lot. And then he would disappear for 3 weeks at a time.
Mm.
He'd be going to Cairo just to buy books.
Mm.
Whoa.
That's
Yes.
cool. These are deep.
Reuven
research.
Firestone. That was his name.
Boom.
Firestone.
He was my son's teacher too.
Wow.
From USC. He went over. Yeah.
That's so crazy. So I think Mr. Firestone was an extremely learned individual, and he was, and also what I found so interesting about the guy was that he was super honest. So he told me a lot about the origins of Israel, and we had a few private conversations, and you mentioned going back to study more about the history. What are some of the new things that you learned during that time?
One of my favorite classes I took was a class in 19th century Jerusalem, which is such an interesting time, especially the second half, because Israel had really opened up. Israel had been very closed off before. The Turks had been terribly mismanaging Israel, or Palestine, it was called, and it was just a very unpleasant place. But starting with Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, but the Muslim conqueror who conquered Egypt at one point, followed by Napoleon or around the same time, it really opened up the culture. And in the 19th century, you had a lot of people come from America, missionaries and others, and it was a very exciting time. So this class was about 19th century Jerusalem. And the class met on Friday morning from 9 to 12 or 9 to 1. And every week it was in a different location because we were actually at the locations where the events happened.
Oh, wow.
And that was a wonderful class just to learn about the history. I was in class with all Israelis except for me, all in Hebrew. And so they were also learning about their city.
Yeah, it was crazy stuff. Maybe we can get into some of the things you mentioned. I learned so many things I hadn't known about before. For example, the involvement of American politics and European politics in the creation of the State of Israel and the many decades between right around, I believe it was 1895, where the World Zionist Federation was formed.
The World Zionist Congress was formed,
Yes.
I think it was the next year or 2 years later, by Theodor Herzl.
Herzl.
That's exactly.
And so there was a chapter opened in America right around that time. But then was that in the U.S.?
No, Herzl never came to the U.S. Herzl
Yeah.
was a very assimilated Jew from Vienna. And he was just trying to solve a problem. The problem was there's a lot of Jews who are persecuted and it's not going to stop. He actually predicted the Holocaust would happen in 50. He said in 50 years there's going to be a terrible tragedy. And he was right on the dot. So at first, most Israelis don't know this. And if they did, they would want to forget it. Herzl said the best way to solve the problem is to convert all the Jews to Christianity. Then we won't have a problem. That was his first. But of course, then he realized, A, that's not how you keep Judaism going. And B, already, even though the Nazis weren't around yet, there was a lot of talk, as in this country too, about this idea that it's a race thing. And it's about eugenics, as they called it. And so therefore, it really doesn't matter what religion you are. You're still going to be persecuted for who your parents were.
So he said if the Jews convert to Christianity, that would make them safe. Is that the idea? Right.
That was his first idea. And then he went to plan B, of course, which was Jews should have their own political entity, just like all the other countries have or wanted to have.
Firestone was a rabbi, right?
I know he's a PhD and his wife is a rabbi. I don't remember if he's a rabbi or not.
Yeah, I don't remember either. You don't think so? Okay.
He's just a PhD.
Okay. Well, I'll call him Mr. Firestone then, but
you call him Doctor.
Doctor. Doctor also mentioned what you were saying right now, where throughout history, he would say, when there was persecution, like the pogroms in Russia, that the Jewish communities would essentially adopt the local majority religion, and they would have a political face that they would put on as a way of defense.
I'm not aware of Jews. The only place I'm aware of Jews actually converting to the local religion was in Spain and Portugal. And it was more because they were very assimilated and they thought this was their ticket into society. Just like we have in 19th century, early 19th century Germany, you'd have Jews do the same thing, like the famous poet Heinrich Heine.
Right.
And he said it was his admission ticket. It wasn't so he could go to church more often. But that's really the only case I can think of. In general, Jews in Europe didn't convert. They just were persecuted and then expelled and brought back.
Well, it's like exactly what you just said. It wasn't like even a technical, real conversion. It was more like we need to get them off our backs kind of thing.
So the Jews were often protected by the nobility. The problem is they also were the source of funding, loans, and the nobility would then dry up and owe the Jews so much money that it was easier to kick them out than to pay them back.
How did that work? Is that implying that the Jewish people were involved in executive finances or political finances at the time?
They were involved, not that they wanted to be. Jews were not allowed to do almost anything else. They couldn't join guilds. They couldn't be craftsmen. They couldn't do almost anything else. And they were forced. It was a terrible thing because they were forced into doing something that needed to be done, but no one falls in love with a moneylender, especially when it's 200% interest as it was and things like that. And then they're blamed for doing it. Think of Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare. They're blamed for doing it, even though they have to do it because the nobility needs it. But then it's the nobility can turn around and say, those Jews, we have to get rid of them because look what they're doing. They're loaning money at interest.
Mhm.
Shocked.
So they were scapegoated.
Where did the
Totally.
money come from? Like where did the large amass of money?
So
come
Jews
from?
didn't have a lot of money, but they had a lot of things that meant they could do the banking. Number one, they trusted one another. They had large families in different areas. And number two, they had the literacy to do it.
Mm.
So, unfortunately,
Makes
but
sense.
it's not like you're making money except through money. It's like
Right.
equities today. They didn't produce anything. They weren't allowed to produce anything. But if you're loaning money at 200% interest, you're going to make some money.
Right.
Yeah. Do you
And-
think they also had, because they were loaning the money, they had some sort of say in what was going on?
Now, mostly in Europe anyway, except for Spain, I'll say that's a little different. But in most of Europe, the Jews never had power, but they would have someone called a Stadtland or an ambassador, someone with some wealth who would represent the Jews with nobility. In Spain, Muslim Spain in the Golden Age, it was a little different. There was someone named Shmuel Hanagid, the great leader who we're talking about more than 1,000 years ago. He was the vizier, the second in command of Spain, Muslim Spain, as a Jew, and he wasn't hiding his Judaism at all. Now, unfortunately, his son took over, and his son had some arrogance about him, so he was killed. They put a sword through his neck because as long as you knew your place, you were fine. But you're never on the level of the Sultan. That's not knowing your place.
Interesting.
I pretty much get all my stuff from Dr. Firestone.
Right? That's a good source.
So I keep just remembering so many things. Yeah. Oh, I was gonna ask about where was the origin of this knowledge of finance in the community come from?
That's a good question.
I think even in the Torah, there are some financial things. They're pretty simple. And then you get to rabbinic Judaism 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. And one has to know about finance. I'll give you an example. Jews throughout the world since the 1920s, if they choose to, can study a page of Talmud every day in sync with other Jews doing it. Same page. Takes 7.5 years. And so today, for instance, we're on a certain page of a tractate in the Talmud, which the Talmud is Jewish rabbinic literature about life and all sorts of things from 1,500 years ago in Babylon. And so one of the things they're talking a lot about is, what does a groom owe a bride? And that's a financial thing. Wedding was seen as a financial thing more than a romantic thing. And what happens if he wants to divorce her? What does he owe her? And so there's a lot of finances involved in community relations. Because if you don't have it, then you have resentment, and then you have a lot worse things.
Right.
Right? When people say it's not about the money, it usually means it's about the money.
Right.
So, it wasn't just Jews, but even in the Torah, Joseph in the Bible is Pharaoh's main money guy. We're told he's the mashpir, he's the supplier of goods and services. In fact, in the Torah, it says that he went one day to the house to do his work. And the rabbis of ancient days say he was an accountant. Sounds like a joke, but no, he was an accountant. At this time, it wasn't the Pharaoh, it was a rich guy named Potiphar. But that was his job to do. Now, in this story, Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, so the story goes in a different direction. But for the ancient rabbis, Joseph was the first accountant.
Wow.
Can we talk about the Talmud?
Sure.
And can you maybe enlighten us from your perspective on what the Talmud is? And also kind of put this on the screen a little bit.
So the Talmud, the word Talmud means learning, but it specifically refers to the fact that about 2,000 years ago, we have something called rabbis. Never had rabbis before. We had teachers, but not rabbis. And during this period, there was a need to codify Jewish law because the laws in the Torah were all over the place. They were hard to know what to do. And so they started writing different laws based on the Torah, but sometimes reflecting more of life's complexities. So when it says in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, don't work on the Sabbath, that's pretty vague. What does that mean? So the rabbis in the Talmud come up with 39 categories of work you can't do. Everything from lighting a fire to ripping something to all sorts of things, to traveling a certain amount. And so that's the Talmud. Now, there's also stories and legends and all sorts of things. People call the Talmud an ocean or a sea. Because perhaps we could use the word encyclopedia today that didn't exist 1,000 years ago. but it's the center part of Jewish life. When a Jewish Orthodox kid is studying from about age 7 until the rest of his life, most likely he's studying the Talmud. It's about 63 volumes. So as I said, if you study one page a day, it'll still take 7.5 years to get through the whole thing.
Oh, wow. Do you know if there is I tried to look it up quickly, but do you know if there is a place where we could see what the daily page is?
Oh, yes. You just have to know how to say it in Hebrew. And you find a million places, podcasts and the like. It's called Daf Yomi. D-A-F Yomi. Daf is page, Yomi is daily. There's a particular podcast I love.
Dafyomi.org.
Well, there's a million places. There's a podcast out of Israel I love from a place called Hadran, Hadran, and it's led by a woman. And originally it was just 4 women, but now because of the pandemic, it really goes out to the whole world.
You mentioned 39
categories.
Of work
you can't do. Yeah.
Is there, when I ask these questions, obviously sometimes I act a little coy, like I don't know,
sure.
But it's our viewers probably don't know a lot about this stuff, so that's why I'm bringing it up.
Yeah, it's definitely.
So, what is the significance of numerology in the Talmud, and is there a significance to 39?
There's something called gematria, which is the rabbinic way of using numbers to explain a lot of things. So, for instance, 18 is a special number because in Hebrew, you write with Hebrew numbers, it's chai, which is life. The 39, I don't know of having any particular numerology. The way the rabbis come up with this list is sort of interesting, though. They say, look, God created the world. God rested on the 7th day. We didn't create the world, so we can't really go by that. But through God's commands, we did create a sacred space, first in the desert and then in Jerusalem. And we can look at the Torah and we can break down the things we did to create that space before we rested. And it turns out if you break it down, it's 39 things. So there are certain numbers that are big in Judaism, 10, 40. Whenever it's 40, like 40 days, 40 nights, 40 years, that's because the period of gestation for a human fetus is 40. So that's always telling you something about rebirth or something.
Interesting.
But 39, I will say one thing. Here's one of the interesting ones I was just telling our 10th graders this week. If you're Orthodox to this day, on the Sabbath, you're not allowed to break these 39 things. So you cannot tear paper.
Wow.
Unless you have a fancy French toilet, that means you got a problem if you've got to tear toilet paper on the Sabbath.
Huh.
So what did traditional Jews do?
A day, I don't know.
No, that would be the fancy French way to go.
Right.
No, they tear it before the Shabbat.
Oh, they have it torn off.
You have to guestimate how much you're going to need before the Sabbath.
Oh my gosh.
So interesting.
And you're like, but last night I just ate at Skyline Chili.
Yeah. So
you're like, so
tear some more. Tear some more. Right?
Or you can have a friend tear it for you.
Well, only a non-Jewish friend. And then you cannot
Non-Jewish
ask them
friend,
to do it. You can only suggest that they do it.
Right.
Boy, I sure could use some more toilet paper.
Right.
What do you think about that? How do you think about that? Because it is it's like a little bit comical. I'm not making fun of it, but like just that notion.
If you believe that God gave us the Torah, and through the Torah and also the rabbinic, or what's called the oral Torah, because first it wasn't written down, then how could you not do it? I mean, that would be like, your boss giving you a direct order and you're ignoring it.
Yeah.
As a Reformed Jew, I follow Spinoza, who in the 1600s suggested that God is more like the God of Star Wars. Okay, he didn't use that term, but that's what he meant. And therefore, God did not command us to do this. We want to find God as a community and we want to take God seriously. But therefore, these rules don't have the same binding quality. If they did, I wouldn't be Reformed. I mean, I'm not Reformed because I'm lazy or I don't care about the tradition. I just come from a very different point of view. By the way, I have a theory, which I haven't been able to prove yet, but I haven't even tried, but I think it's true. Spinoza influenced a 20th century rabbi named Mordechai Kaplan, who had the same idea. We call it religious naturalism. It's not that he doesn't believe in God. It's just that God is more of a force of nature. And I believe, this is where I'm not sure, but I believe that Mordechai Kaplan may have taught a young Jewish kid in New York named Rod Serling, who would later grow up to produce the Twilight Zone TV show.
I was going to say, I feel like I knew that name.
But what I do know for a fact is George Lucas said he got the idea of the Force in Star Wars from Rod Serling. So I just need to one day prove how Mordechai Kaplan taught Rod Serling, and then I can make the connection from Spinoza to the Jedi.
That is so interesting you mentioned that. There's other names that I've heard George Lucas claim he gets.
Well, Joseph Campbell would be the main one.
Joseph Campbell.
Right.
and another individual who is kind of lost in history a little bit, but definitely known by people that are into this kind of work. Have you heard of Jordan Maxwell?
I don't think so.
No.
Hmm.
The story goes that, and I learned so much from Jordan. Like, for example, the Vulcan thing and stuff of that nature. That Hollywood gets a lot of their ideas in general from rabbis and priests and theologians and individuals who are heavily into the mythology and religious mythology and esotericism, things of that nature.
We don't always get credit for it.
Yeah.
I once had a congregant in Los Angeles who said, I'm in this show called Picket Fences. And I said, I hear it's a great show. It's on Friday nights, so I'll never watch. I can never watch it Friday nights.
Mhm.
But he was playing a rabbi and he wanted some help with his lines. So I rewrote his lines for him. Didn't get credit, didn't deserve credit because I'm not part of the Screenwriters Guild. But that particular Friday night the TV show was on, this was in the 90s, I happened to be not at the pulpit. So I turned on the TV and I watched and I heard this character say the lines I'd written.
Wow.
And I realized even if I gave sermons on high holidays to thousands of Jews every year, I would never reach as many people as my words had reached that night.
Wow. That is so interesting. What do maybe, for example, a Hasidic Jew think about your Reformed Judaism?
Well, what's really sad is the Hasidic movement started around 1700. Again, they had no connection with Spinoza, who was in Amsterdam, whose parents or ancestors had come from Spain and Portugal after the expulsion. But the first Hasidic Jew, a guy named the Baal Shem Tov, completely adhered to what I will call this non-dualism. Non-dualistic theology doesn't say there's no God, but it says there's no difference between us and God. All is God is how they would put it if they were speaking German and not Polish or Yiddish. And what's really sad is they were going in a great direction with that, but the heat was too intense. The non-Hasidic were so anti this and pressured them so much that today you wouldn't consider them connected with that. So I'm not a Hasidic Jew, but in many ways I am a neo-Hasidic Jew. I take their early ideas and I really believe in them. People like Nachman of Bratslav or the Baal Shem Tov, some of these amazing rabbis who unfortunately their descendants had to go back into the fold. So it's really sad in a way because they were onto something.
Is there a rift at all? Like
there was a huge rift between the Hasidic and the non-Hasidic back 200 years ago. The Hasidic called the non-Hasidic the misnagdim, the opponents. It was terrible. But they don't really talk to each other now, but they agree that they're on the right side and we liberal Jews are on the wrong side. So I have friends who are Chabad rabbis in certain places, but they don't look at us as serious Jews.
So speaking of that kind of reminded me about something you said earlier about the 40-day gestation period of a baby. What do Reform Jews think about something like a Roe versus Wade decision, and what do Hasidic Jews think about this?
It's a good question. And I won't just say Hasidic, because Hasidic is just one branch of ultra-Orthodox. All those opponents are still very much around. They don't call themselves opponents, but they're often called by names like Young Israel and things like this.
Okay.
The most famous rabbi of their generation of the 20th century in America, Orthodox rabbi, was actually one of them, who was just called the Rabbi or the Rav, Soloveitchik. He was a rabbi in Boston. So Orthodox Judaism knows, unless they're trying to deny it for political reasons, that abortion is acceptable in Jewish law because the life of the mother always comes first. And the only question is, are we talking about the physical life or the mental life as well? Reform Judaism decided decades ago, we're going to keep this simple and say the woman has the right to choose, end of story. That is harder to support from ancient Jewish texts than what I can certainly support, which is you always choose the life of the mother over the baby. And there's a theology behind it. If you're Catholic, the baby dies, the baby goes to hell. The baby hasn't been baptized. The mother, assuming has been baptized, dies, but she goes to heaven. We don't have that kind of dichotomy in Judaism.
Did they say that? Do they say that the baby goes to hell?
That is the theology of the church until you're baptized.
Yeah, I guess if
you
they
look
say
at the
that,
sermon
yeah.
from the 1800s or 18th century, 1700s, sermon, sinners at the hands of an angry God. The preacher is saying babies have a very nice hell, but it's still hell because they're born into sin. And when you're born into sin and you have to be baptized to not be born into sin. I mean, you're still in sin, but you'll be saved. We Jews don't believe the same thing. When we talk about sin, we don't mean a state of being. We mean doing the wrong thing. So it's a vastly different point of view.
That is very interesting. And now it's not like I was ultra involved in it or wanted to be involved in it. I grew up Catholic and then eventually attended a Jesuit high school.
Oh, in Cincinnati?
So I went to St. Xavier
Oh, of course.
High School, but then I also went to the School for Creative and Performing Arts.
Nice. I used to teach at Xavier College.
Oh, at Xavier College.
Yeah.
What was
Or
interesting?
Xavier University.
Xavier University. That's actually a really good school. What was really interesting, my dad was very much older, like a much older dad. So that means my grandfather was much, much, much older. And I'm talking like my dad was born in 1934.
Okay, my dad was born in 1918, so
So whatever hit my grandfather was born in, I forget. But anyway, he actually went to Xavier University that early on when it was like completely not normal to go to college as like an average Joe.
Yeah.
My dad didn't go, obviously, but we have a lot of talk about that in my family. I forget exactly where that was leading, but just to bring it back to the Roe v. Wade thing, just because I think that's an interesting thing, especially when it comes to the religions.
Yeah.
Do they say that there is a cutoff, like a threshold where it's, okay, this is too far?
So in Jewish tradition, the thing is the following. No one is going to argue that, you get pregnant, you decide after 36 weeks you're just not into it, you're going to have an abortion. No one is arguing that's the right thing to do. But according to Jewish tradition, if the mother's life is in danger, until half of the baby is out of the womb, so if only 1/3 or 1/4 of the baby is out of the womb, it's treated no different than if it were a tumor. It's the most sad thing in the world, but you treat it like a rodef, the Hebrew word for pursuer. It's a toxic thing that's trying to kill the mother. And you take it out limb by limb, and that's how you do it. That's the Jewish point of view.
Now, I definitely understand the danger to the mother, for sure, of course, in all circumstances. But does that defining of the baby weird you out a little bit?
Of course. It's a terrible thing. I mean, none of this is good. But, ethical dilemmas are always about two goods or two bads, never about a good and a bad.
Yeah. Right? And that's why they're interesting to talk about.
Yeah. I share with my 8th and 9th graders when I teach them, the first thing I do is show them the trolley car experiments.
Yeah.
Right. Where you have to decide who you're going to save. And that's life. You got to have.
And most of the kids get it. They say, kill one to save 10.
They do. They fall into the John Stuart Mill utilitarianism approach, but not all of them. But to me, I as I like to say, in this day and age, a lot of people talk about critical race theory. Should we be teaching it or not? I say, let's just bracket that and talk about critical thinking theory. I want to teach kids how to think. If you can do that critically, then the rest will follow.
And let's just go into that. When teaching kids like this, and you want to teach them how to think, can you describe that a little bit? Describe your perspective.
Sure. Well, it's actually not mine. I was able to study in Jerusalem with the best Jewish educator of the 20th century, a woman named Nechama Leibowitz. And every Monday night in her little apartment by the Jerusalem bus station, about 50 of us, different parts of Jerusalem, all different denominations, would fit into her little study, and she would teach us. And she would say over and over again, because most of us were teachers or educators, there's 3 reasons why you teach children the Bible. Number 1, so they know what's in the Bible. She would say in her German Hebrew accent, that's a bad reason because they're going to forget it, kids. Number 2, you teach it so they learn how to think critically, especially in Judaism, not just in Judaism. Every verse of the Bible has different commentaries, different ways of looking at it, reading it this way, that way, throughout the generations. And you learn how to think critically. Just like when I was an English major, we weren't just reading novels, we were reading commentary on the novels. That was the whole point. And commentaries on commentaries. Of course, there's a third reason to teach, which is they might be transformed into better human beings. That of course, is the highest hanging fruit, and that's what we want. But even number 2 ain't bad.
I like all that. I mean, I think that that's right. And I definitely agree with you so much that we need to teach the children how to think. Maybe not tell them what to think, but teach them how to think for themselves.
As opposed to how to get a certain score on a test so they can go their way and the school can get money.
Yeah. And, we were just talking about this on another podcast the other night with one of our friends. I feel like looking back at school, high school, middle school, I didn't learn so many things that were tangible that I'm using today. Now I'm not counting what I was able to read, all the books that I read, because I learned a lot from that. Even if there were stories, writing, we need to know how to write. But I wish that I had been taught more practical things as well, like finance, investment, taxes.
I agree with all of that. Although I would say, and I say this to our high school kids that I teach, it was David Brooks, a New York Times columnist, who said it. What you learn in high school for your success in life is more important than what you learn in college. And it's what happens before the bell rings. Because if you think about it, if you're not being homeschooled, if you're in a school environment, you have to learn things. You don't have to be popular, but you have to learn what makes people popular. You have to learn to read people.
Oh, yeah.
You have to learn how to read the room. You have to learn how to socialize.
Totally.
And that's so important.
It definitely is. Yeah, I think that, even navigating unfriendly situations, if you get bullied or you see this happening, that's an important learning experience as well. Or even the notion of competition. Not everybody can be first place. Right. And it means you have to learn how to strive to that position. And if we make everybody first, then there is no such thing as first.
Yes, we like to give everyone trophies. I had a congregant in Los Angeles named Wendy Mogul, and she wrote a book at the time, very well known now, called The Blessings of a Skin Knee. And then later she wrote a second one, The Blessing of a B-. Kids need to learn how to fail well, fail up.
Yeah, fail up.
And you can't do that if every time they fall, they're being protected by, trampoline or something.
Would you agree that there's a funny thing about human nature where it doesn't appear that we learn anything unless we fail?
Right, exactly
like
true.
Never.
Right.
And then once you realize this pattern of failure, if you want to call it that, and then failure, lesson, you find that it isn't the failure that defines the person. It's just very much the reaction and how they assimilate that experience.
It was Miles Davis who said, if you make the wrong note in jazz, it's not a problem. It's the next note.
And that's a great point, actually, because one of the things I've been practicing lately is turning a mistake into an idea.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting concept, really, because it's not a mistake.
Well, it depends on what happens next.
Exactly.
When I called a congregant a few years ago when I was in Miami and said, I'm sorry to hear you're not rejoining the temple, he said, I don't know what you're talking about. We rejoined. It's a mistake. And I said, well, I'm so glad this mistake happened because now I can tell you how much we value your membership. Right?
That's a great point.
That is a good point.
Gary Lee Schuster, right? We had a podcast with him. His name Gary, Mr. Schuster?
Which guy was this?
The guy that interviewed people in Israel.
Oh.
So we had a podcast with an individual.
Let me find his name.
Who is Jewish, a Jewish man living in Israel right now.
Working at Tel Aviv University.
Mm-hmm. And he gained YouTube success by interviewing all sorts of people in Israel. All sorts. And so what he would like to do is often kind of get different perspectives. Like we were talking about Hasidic Jews, right? Mm-hmm. Versus Reform. And I really want to find that podcast because there are specific things. Oh, okay. So he referred to a group. I believe they were Orthodox. I don't know, Hasidic. I don't want to make a mistake there. Sure. But essentially a group of Jews that were not Zionists. What is that about?
Right. So there are it's a very small group of ultra-Orthodox who believe that the only time there can be a Jewish state is when the Messiah comes. And for Jews, the Messiah is never God, not Jesus, but is a person who will bring this age of peace and the end of time. And until he comes, and it's a he, a descendant of David, until that happens, you can't have a Jewish state. So therefore, even early on in the state of Israel, they would say things on walls like Zionism is evil and things like that, even though they lived in Israel and were recipients of money from the state. They just couldn't buy into the idea. But that's a very small group of Orthodox Jews.
What is the role of the Rabbinical Tribunal or the Rabbinical Court?
The Beit Din. So
Yes.
Beit Din is what we call rabbinic court.
So sorry about that.
It's okay.
You're
I'm hearing
like,
voices now. So a Beit Din is simply the rabbinic court. After 2,000 years ago, Jews lost any power to have any capital punishment. In other words, we lost all sovereignty. Rome saw to that. So the only rabbinic court you could have is a civil one if people agreed to not go to the authorities, but instead to go to the civil court. So mostly it was matters of civil nature and not criminal nature.
Gotcha.
And that's what it is to this day.
and by the way, just for the record, it's Corey Gill Schuster.
Yeah, I said Gary. My bad. My
You're
bad,
close.
Gary.
That was it's funny when we did this podcast with him. This is just an aside. His time difference is so
Right.
great. I think Armin and I played a gig on like a Friday night or Saturday night, some night from 7 to 11 or something. Went home, set up, and started the thing at midnight.
Oh,
And it
because he was just
morning.
getting up.
Yeah, and it was morning for him or something along those lines.
When you get a medical test today, it's often ready the next day because they send it off, and doctors in Israel will do the work of interpreting it and then send it back. It's cool, taking advantage of the time difference.
What medical test?
Whatever medical test it is that they need to look at it and analyze it. That's
Yeah,
not
blood
any
test.
kind, but they do that a lot now.
Oh, wow.
I also believe that there are extremely fast. You don't quote me on this, but I'm aware that there's technology which can essentially take deep electromagnetic microscopic images of even blood samples, so wherein they don't even have to send the blood.
Probably, yeah. They have the
They have
ability.
a whole
wow.
computer image that they
Right.
work on. So
These are
that's where
interesting
we're-
times.
Yeah, that's where we're at right now.
One thing that Corey was big on, which I think is a reason why we wanted to have him on. I just started watching his videos one day. I was just like, wow, this is kind of interesting. And he speaks Hebrew, which helps that he can really get in there with the people.
Right. And Israelis in general like to talk, so it's not going to have a problem.
He was asking a lot about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and just kind of what people thought. And it was definitely interesting because he would go both sides, Palestinians and Israelis. And you would have plenty of people who are like, I'm not feeling it. I'm not seeing too much conflict, or I don't care. They're just like me, whatever, coming from both sides. But then he would have people that were very dogmatic in their beliefs about either side. So you really saw the whole spectrum. And it's I think especially to somebody like me, like really a lay person when it comes to that, I still feel like I have trouble even understanding where it's coming from, what's going on. But I'm just not in that world as much.
The answer is actually not very difficult, sadly. And Dr. Firestone could point it out. First of all, with all respect to the Queen, God bless the Queen, but England was not a very nice country, Great Britain. And they started all of this. They don't care. They're not going to take the blame. But in 1916, England signed a secret deal with France to give the Arabs all of Palestine. Even though England and France weren't controlling it yet, it was still the Turks. But this was the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Mark Sykes was the English, and then Picot was in France. Okay, so you put that aside. And then the next year, they came out with a declaration, the Balfour Declaration, saying that Palestine would be the Jewish homeland, or a Jewish homeland, as they changed it to say. So, yeah, this is a nice house. You own this house. Turns out I sold it to someone else too. Now you guys can fight it out. That's what happened.
Right.
And
Do you
then,
think that was purposeful?
I don't know if it was purposeful. It just showed lack of care,
Mhm.
right? They would say anything. Of course, they didn't control they wanted to win World War I. They were more concerned about that than anything else.
Yeah, I'm only asking that because if I was a real estate agent and I sold a house to two parties, I feel like that's kind of sus. You know what I
Well,
mean?
it's
Right, you
terrible,
know what
right?
you're
But
doing.
the British, they were a huge empire then, and they didn't
Yeah.
really care. So in the next few decades, Arab nationalism really picked up, and Jewish nationalism continued. And the British finally, of course, just walked away. And in 1948, Israel became a state, only half of what had been, less than half. And the Arab nations refused to accept it, this partition plan, and there was a big war. And Israel has been able to defend itself ever since. The worst thing that ever happened for all of this is in 1949, when there was a truce, an armistice, fighting stopped. There were many Arabs who had been forced out of their homes or left out of fear, or sometimes simply left because the Arab army said, leave, we're going to kill the Jews, you come back. And they were displaced.
Mhm.
They were put into refugee camps in Egypt and in the West Bank, what would be called the West Bank. And then the Arab countries controlling these areas, Egypt and Jordan in particular, didn't do anything with their own Arab compatriots except leave them to fester as political pawns to show the world, the terrible state of Israel, even though they could do anything they wanted, right? They could have brought them in and made them part of the country. So from 1949 to 1967, these refugee camps were the responsibility of the Arab countries, and they did nothing. And then after the Six-Day War, Israel won this territory, and I would say in many ways foolishly kept it, because I remember being in Israel when the king of Jordan in 1988 said, hey, all those refugees in the West Bank, we don't care about them anymore. It's Israel's problem now. Right?
Who was the president? I mean, the
king
of Jordan at that
That's
time?
the present king's father, King Hussein. Well, the new one's also Hussein, but yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I thought it was funny recently. I feel like a lot of people, whether it's on Facebook or something like that, are sharing pictures of the Queen. They're making them they're making her their profile picture.
Interesting. Yeah.
All this kind of stuff, and I'm kind of glad that you brought up that point because, I'm not some champion of the Queen or even the monarchy in general, and it's interesting that you said what you said about the Queen in regarding that specific thing.
And the Queen never visited Israel, ever. Her husband did, her son did. And she was a very believing Christian. I think she would have loved it. But Britain has a real soiled history when it comes to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Really soiled. And that it would be too awkward had she come, I think. There's too many questions.
Highly, I would say this is what I'm about to say could be misconstrued, but I want to be very specific when I say it. But I believe that when a large empire does something of that nature, where they are essentially playing with land and people's belief systems, I believe that we can find countless examples of this happening even today with something as simple as a two-party system. I believe the two-party system is a theater. I believe it is created to perpetuate a dogmatic infighting, and so that you can line up your constituents in half, split them in two, and by small margins, you could say, okay, this period of time will be for us. This period of time will be for you. And then we'll go back and forth. You have any comments about that?
Well, someone famously said that the United States system of government is the worst ever created except for all the other ones.
Right.
The truth is, I think most Americans, when I take Americans to Israel or just teach about Israel, they have no idea what government in other places is like because it's so different for almost the entire rest of the world. There's a wonderful TV show called Bergen about Danish politics, the first woman prime minister. Before there was a woman prime minister, the TV show had this. It's a fictional show. And everyone should watch a show like that if they want to understand a government like Israel, because it's coalition politics. It's so different. And one of the great things about it is when the prime minister's government fails, the next person takes over immediately.
Right.
As opposed, before Franklin Roosevelt, they changed it. There were 6 months between the election and the new president. Even 3 months seems like a long time.
Yeah.
especially this last time.
What was the controversy with Bibi and that happened recently last year where he essentially stepped down?
So the controversy, well, there's two. There's a lot of people who say that he is guilty of taking bribes and things like that. The bigger issue is in a coalition government, you need 61 votes to make a government because out of 120, so you have a majority. And no party, including the Likud, which is Benjamin Netanyahu's party, has the 61 votes. So you have to make deals with other parties, coalition government. And there's been 4 or 5 elections now where they just can't get a big enough block to have a sustained government for very long. And that's why there's going to be another election in a few weeks. Because the Israeli people are really split down the middle.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I would at some point love to go to Israel just to see the history, feel the history, the food.
Food is amazing. And Tel Aviv is especially known for amazing food. And it's all true. Unfortunately, it's all very expensive now. Tel Aviv was just voted the most expensive city in the world.
Really?
Wow.
I did not know that.
Must be a nice place then.
It's great, but
So
it's a little weird to think
the
that.
thing about the two-party system that I was learning the other day is, we have the eagle as our symbol of our country, symbol of freedom, symbol of our country, also an ancient symbol of the sun.
Phoenix.
Eagle's usually been a bad symbol if you look at most of history, though. Usually it's the people who are doing the persecuting who have the eagle. I'm not talking about America, but it's an interesting thing.
It's a fascist symbol.
Yeah.
And
We were about.
and I'm not saying America's not that either, but and actually I do believe that the eagle is the sun as well.
Yeah, in Egypt it was the phoenix.
Okay. And it has 2 wings. And from what I was looking at reading, that is one reason that we have a 2-party system, because you have 2 wings and you have a head controlling its wings. And that, that might even be considered a upper group above
Interesting.
the parties.
You know why there's a left and right wing, where those terms come from? The left wing and the right wing?
What is your?
I'd heard it was because the first democratic meeting of all time of this kind was in Paris, and they had to have it in a church just to fit it in the right place. And they had people on the left and people on the right sitting on this 2 parts of the church.
Interesting. Well, another thing that I was seeing is that, and actually this was kind of based around like our dollar bill. And there's so much symbolism on our dollar bill.
There is, yes.
Even in just everything with the eagle, we've got the 9 feathers.
Well, pull it up.
Yeah. We've got the 9 feathers. Well, actually, what would you like me to pull up?
The dollar bill, like the back of it.
Okay.
Originally, they were going to have on the dollar bill the Israelites leaving Egypt.
Really?
That's what Benjamin Franklin wanted.
Why did
That's
he
the
want
story.
that? Oh,
Because the early Americans saw themselves as pilgrims, leaving behind King George III Pharaoh.
but we're told that Benjamin was a deist, right?
Right. So he believed that God created the world and didn't do much after that.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
So, we've got 9 feathers down here. We've got 30, I believe it's 32 feathers on the left and 33 on the right.
Yeah.
I may need a refresher.
The 13 stars of the 13 original colonies right there, which also create a star,
Of
a symbol that we are perhaps familiar with, that some refer to as the Star of David. But there's other names, and I do want to ask you about that because I don't know much about that. What else do you know about it, Jeff?
Well, here's a question I like to ask people. What 4 words have always been on the United States dollar? It's
In
a trick
God
question.
we trust.
That's the trick. No.
Yeah.
United States of America,
No,
which is actually 5 words.
That was
but
the second one I was going to say.
In
Yeah.
God we trust was only added same time
That was in
that
1950
the
something,
50s.
right?
Right.
Same time, One Nation Under God. Under God was added to the. It was because of the communist scare, and they felt this was the way to fight communism by
Right.
putting religion into the politics.
Something that I was curious about the other night is when, maybe it was from the start, but I just hadn't gotten this piece of information. When was the Annuit Coeptus and the Novus Ordo Seclorum put on
And
the
can
dollar
you
bill?
look
I don't know.
up in
Yeah.
Latin what Annuit Coeptus is and Novus Ordo Seclorum, if we can get a Google
Yeah.
translate?
New World Order or something like that.
Yeah, I believe it's the New Secular Order.
And they're saying like you could translate it to the New World Order, and anu equipped should mean
Our enterprise
go
is
to
successful.
it. Yeah.
Something along those lines.
All I know is when I say something in Latin, I'm probably trying to impress someone.
Yeah.
Mutatis mutandis.
The cool
Sine
thing
qua
about
non.
Yes.
the high school that I went to is that we did do Latin a lot.
Yeah.
Fortunately,
So-
I grew of age in the 70s, and they wouldn't teach Latin in my high school in Kansas City because it was not relevant. That was the age of relevancy.
Well, I find that Latin, I mean, look, I was just speaking to a lawyer the other day, a very elite lawyer in the United States. And she was telling me that essentially all of this stuff till today, law is based on maritime admiralty law, or the concept of the oceans and the concept of trading, concepts that go back even before the Silk Road. And she was explaining to me that, I mean, effectively, our law to today is Roman.
A lot of it, yes.
So to understand Latin is to understand law, essentially.
Res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself.
There you go.
I'm trying to impress it.
So it does mean, our enterprise is successful, and then we have our New World Order, and then we got everybody else. We got the pyramid, the eye.
What's interesting is,
hidden
because
owl.
I was in Egypt 3 years ago, right as the pandemic was starting. What we associate with Egypt is not even Egyptian. It is a Hellenistic, Greco-Roman view of the authenticity of ancient Egypt.
Right.
So it makes sense that in America we would do the same thing.
Yeah. Totally. I totally agree with that. And these traditions have been melted, bastardized, diffused, combined with other things.
If you want to talk about someone who learned from his failures, was Ulysses S. Grant. I just saw him on. There's a wonderful book by Ron Chernow, the same guy who wrote Hamilton that became a musical. No one's turned the Grant book into a musical, probably won't. But this guy failed at so many things. He was an alcoholic, and he became a very good president.
Have you seen this?
I feel like we're doing national. What's that movie called?
National Treasure.
National
Treasure, yeah.
You
What
can
is
actually see it on a dollar bill if we got one out. But there is a little hidden owl in here.
Oh wow!
And again, you can actually get out $1.
I can't remember the last time I've carried $1. Like I have no cash. I haven't had cash for years.
That's interesting.
Really?
They're trying to make it all cashless now, right?
I think we run into cash more
Maybe from
music, just because of tips and that kind of stuff. And it's an interesting thing. If we do go into a cashless society, or if something happens with the economy to where our fiat currency loses all its value,
right?
It's going to be really messy.
Here's my question. The government says no more. They say, Rabbi Goldberg, no more dollars. But we have our Fed coin, which is an electronic currency. And it's so great because you can track every single coin, and it'll be on a public ledger for everyone to see, but it'll be private and anonymous. How does that sound to you?
I'm too old. I was upset when Nixon took us off the gold standard. I don't do the electronic stuff at all. I don't trust it. Too many scams out there.
So you don't trust it?
I don't.
Yeah,
why do I trust paper? I mean, no, there's nothing rational about it. I'm a digital immigrant, my age. You're never going to trust it in the same kind of way.
I agree, and I feel the same way. Although I'm not very old, I'm only 30 years old, but I kind of feel the same way.
I mean, I was watching a couple speeches from the World Economic Forum the other night, and it was from their Davos meeting, and listening to them discuss this Fed coin, or actually it may not have been exactly the Fed coin, but a world global currency.
They said every nation would have their own bank coin.
That's on a blockchain. And so
all I know is if Matt Damon has to sell it to you, you
right,
don't want to buy it. I mean, if they need a celebrity to sell it, I'm sorry.
And that they use a lot of celebrities, right?
I mean, it's George Clooney, if he owns the liquor company, or Ryan, okay, Aviation Gin, they own it. I understand why they're pitching it.
Right.
Why is Matt Damon pitching it unless they want to make you believe something that you shouldn't necessarily believe?
I completely agree with that. And
do you mean that
we see that in a
Rabbi
lot of stuff?
Goldberg, do you mean that you don't trust that kind of?
My mom was the same way too. Maybe because she was running from the Nazis. I'm just I get skeptical.
Yeah, I got you.
Very skeptical.
Yeah. Another thing that I was looking at the other night that kind of plays into that is I was really getting into who owns everything, who owns all the major companies, and it's really a few.
Well, who is the World Economic Forum? Where are these people coming?
Right. Well, it's going to tie into that. So we've got, the Vanguard Group, we've got BlackRock, we've got Berkshire Hathaway. Those are the biggest. There are a couple, there's some more after that, but the Vanguard
Tell
Group,
them who does Berkshire because they'll know about that. Warren Buffett, right?
Warren Buffett from Omaha.
Right.
Right. And then we have John Fink of BlackRock. And then what's interesting about the Vanguard Group is that there's a stipulation that you can't actually see the shareholder names. Now, we do know the CEO is Mortimer J. Forget his last name. Also weird, there's not a lot on Wikipedia about him. And then this all ties into the World Economic Forum, and BlackRock is lending to world banks because they control, I believe, a total of 20 trillion in capital globally, which is insane.
Yeah.
And when I was going into all this, I was thinking, wow, this is really diminishing my trust in a lot of things, that everything is owned by 3 companies, more like 2.
Right. But you can also look at something nice, like the owner of Patagonia just gave away his entire fortune.
I saw that, actually. That is nice, but also we should just look and see if Patagonia is owned by BlackRock or Vanguard.
Well, if it was, I don't think he could give it away. I will say that there was a time when many people said Jews own all the things, which was always a canard, never the truth, but a useful lie to justify persecution. So one has to be careful. But
well, to
That's my
say
position.
that, I don't want to get into race stuff. I don't care. I just look at money. If the money is trickling down from your pocket,
follow the money. As,
it's pretty simple.
Watergate said, yes.
You're right. And I mean, if I was, put it to you this way, okay? We talk about learning about taxes and finances, all the stuff you don't learn about in school. When you do learn a little bit about taxes and finances, you realize, for example, that taxes are created such that the government incentivizes certain activities and disincentivizes others. And the activities they incentivize are activities that are going to benefit the state. So they might incentivize drilling,
Right.
tax deductible. They might incentivize home ownership, right? Certain deductions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's also trusts and funds and nonprofit organizations, things of that nature.
And a lot of lobbyists.
And a lot of lobbyists. So then when you realize the complexity of the system that they're playing with, then you learn that the $1 billion that somebody like Bill Gates would donate,
Right.
that's all non-taxable money that is then siphoned back into the funds and trusts that he has created. So it's a donation, but it's got a lot of perks for him.
Well, listen, my kids, I have 2 kids, and they were 3 years apart. And when my youngest was about 8 or 9, he won something. Not that he deserved it. He would be the first to say that. It was still the early internet age as far as shopping goes. And there was the late, great Toys R Us store. Although I think they're trying to bring it back. In any case, he ordered all these things, and they didn't come. And the head of the CEO wrote him an email saying,
Wow.
"We're so sorry, it's not going to come in time for Christmas." He didn't care about Christmas, but he didn't know that. So here's $100 in Jeffrey money. So Jeffrey money was money with Jeffrey the dinosaur on it. It was 5 $20 bills, but you could go to the store and spend, Toys R Us and spend it for $100. It was a great thing. So my son gets the 5 bills. The first thing he does is give 20 of them to his older brother. Now, this son who did that is graduating Columbia Business School in a few months, so he was bright back then too. He wasn't doing it to be nice. He wasn't doing it to be fair. First of all, he'd be doing it to be fair. He would have given them more, right? Because he didn't earn that money. So why was he giving him $20? Why? So he'd shut up and not bother him for more.
Right.
I think that's what you're saying.
Right.
Right. You know, some of it is if we give you
It's
this.
bribes.
Yeah, it's bread and circuses in the
Right.
Roman period, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, listen, government is always going to be by people, and it's going to bring out the worst, but hopefully the best. That's why we have to have the media.
Mhm.
We have to have some kind of democracy. It was Justice Brandeis who said, sunshine is the best disinfectant.
Mhm.
And Jewish tradition has always been skeptical that left to its own devices, governments won't protect the needy. So we have to do it because, I guess we're more Hobbesian as Jews than we are Lockean.
That's an interesting point.
Yes.
And also, Chad, can you bring up the etymology of the word government?
Mhm.
So when I think about language and the words we use, I think about all the things that we agree that is the meaning of what we're saying. And oftentimes we agree about our realities and our meanings, but we may not necessarily know the true context of these words.
I think it's actually worse than that, but I'm interested in what you. I'll tell you why in a second.
I would love to hear what you think.
Go to trying to find. Right. Okay. Gubermatio.
So it's steering or a pilot.
Yeah,
Steering
the
minds.
mind. Yeah.
Steering the mind.
Well, that's a good magic trick, right?
It is.
What did they say? The devil's greatest trick?
Right.
I think he doesn't exist.
So when you use the word magic, that's our friend. He's one of the best cats I've ever met. When you say magic, that is so interesting because you don't mean literal magic,
No, I mean sleight of hand,
right?
or not displacement, but people are looking over here while you're taking the stuff from over there.
Right.
That's a very common thing.
Mhm.
What I was going to say is, let's say we decided we're going to go for coffee, and instead of being the coffee connoisseurs that we are, I make it simple. We're going to meet at Starbucks in Houston.
Mm.
What are the odds that we're going to meet for coffee if I just say Starbucks in Houston? Very bad, because there's a lot of Starbucks in Houston.
Mhm.
Even though you understood everything I said, right? So tonight, as I said, I'm teaching a class on New Testament for Jews.
Right.
And one of the first things I have to do is say English is a Christian language. And so the words that we use in English, we think mean one thing, but originally they meant something very different.
Mhm.
When I say the word Messiah, I mean someone anointed with oil, like the king will be in England, although we won't see that on TV.
Mhm.
Not God, not Jesus.
Mhm.
When I say atonement, it means something totally different. When I say sin, it means something totally different. But it's the same word in English.
Mhm.
So it gets very confusing.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh man, that's so crazy. I can't stop thinking of stuff. Go ahead.
You know what I wanted to say earlier that I totally forgot about? You mentioned gematria.
Yeah.
And we are big into it.
Okay.
And-
Why are you into it?
Okay. This is what I was going to.
Rabbi Goldberg, we're into a lot of stuff.
No, but
The first introduction that I got to it, I randomly came across. Trying to remember how I came across this book.
Bible code.
Yeah.
okay.
The Torah Code.
Okay. Yeah.
Have you heard of this?
Sure.
Yeah. So that was maybe my introduction to it, which, correct me if I'm wrong anywhere, but it was basically a secular scientist going into the Torah and understanding that there is a relationship of numbers to the script, which is built into Hebrew already,
that's
which
true.
is where
Aleph is
gematria,
one,
Right.
Bet is two.
right,
Exactly.
which is so cool and really interesting. And anyway, he was going into this, and basically the Torah Code, this is the assertion of this book, is that it is predicting events. And he even wrote a letter to Netanyahu at the time,
Mhm.
if I'm accurate on that, I believe I am, that there was going to be an assassination attempt or an assassination, I think.
Hmm.
This was years ago that I read the book, by the way, so my memory of it is a little shaky. But it ended up happening, whatever it was. And it was transcribed through the code found in the Torah. And they also put other books that had similar word count, like Moby Dick, giant books, Count of Monte Cristo, I believe as well, to see if, is it simply because of the amount of letters or the amount of characters, and it wasn't. And so they're saying they could predict events off of this. So that kind of got me into that. And then we had a really amazing person on our podcast who runs a YouTube channel called Gematrinator.
Oh, wow.
And he created a website that takes all the different ciphers, English, Hebrew, trigonal, Sumerian, Pythagorean, all these different ciphers. And then he'll go into current events or stories of people's deaths. And he will show you all the numerical links in the gematria that play into it. And so when the queen died, he did a whole video on the gematria surrounding the death of the queen.
Well, again, I don't know how that works. And I'm not saying it doesn't work. To quote Hamlet, there are more things in earth, heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. But I do think it's also just human nature to try to make meaning out of uncertainty or absurdity.
Totally.
So even if it didn't work, we'd still want it.
Totally.
Right. And the only thing that I can say to the gematria that I thought was interesting was he is not saying that there's meaning in it, but what he has become very good at himself, and we've tried to do it ourselves with the calculator, and it's kind of hard, is pattern recognition of saying like, and you also, like you said, there are numbers that are associated with meaning already. Like in Hebrew, like you said, 40, 19.
I mean, people, if you ask the average Jew if they know something, they'll say there's 613 commandments. But where does the number 613 come from?
Mm-hmm.
Right? There was a rabbi almost 2,000 years ago who gave a sermon, and he said, we should observe God's commandments every day of the year. And he was using the solar year, so that was 365, with every bone in our body. And I'm not sure he knew how many bones we had, but for him, what he thought, it added up to the days of the year and the bones of the body, 613. So all he was doing was making a sermonic illustration that we should serve God every day with our bodies.
Ah.
But of course, someone heard that and said there must be 613 commandments, and then they started making a list.
And so that is fascinating right there, because it does appear that ancient texts are written with this kind of allegorical meaning that's deeper. If you take it just one way, you're missing out at least 50% of something else.
Well, Christianity developed three senses of scripture, the allegorical as well as the what they call the plain sense. And rabbis developed four: mystical, the plain contextual sense, the homiletical or the sort of sermonic moralistic, and there's one other one too, which I'm forgetting. It's that time of day.
We had
Pardes is it? So it's Shat simple. Remez is allegorical. That was it. Then Drash, homiletic, and Sod is the Kabbalah, the mystical understanding.
I love that you mentioned that, because we were talking about types of knowledge, wherein you can be great at, for example, regurgitating a lot of memorized information, which is useful.
Especially before they had the printing press.
Exactly. And it's particularly useful for...
Real quick, are you allergic to cats?
I am, but I haven't had any reaction, so I wouldn't worry. Because I assume your cat goes on the couch sometimes, right?
Yes.
So we would know by now.
Okay.
I'm fine.
Well, maybe just get him out of here.
My sister lost her cat when I was about 8 years old because I was allergic. And to this day, I think she thought they made the wrong choice.
And cats love people that are allergic to them. Have you noticed that?
Really? No, I've never noticed that.
They just know somehow.
That's
They want to.
yeah. No, it's not a problem.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So types of knowledge. And I keep forgetting the exact term for this, but let me come back to that in a second. Experiential knowledge. That's not even the true term. There's a much more visceral word that explains much better what I mean by experienced knowledge. But essentially, regurgitating knowledge, one level, and then there is kind of more holistic knowledge where you're able to make implications.
Right. That's much more important.
Much more important.
True stories that never happened. It's not about the facts. It's about the human. Well, it's what Joseph Campbell was getting at. It's the mythology that is human.
Yes, and not only that, but okay, well, see, the mythology that is not on you. I would say that was about to be level 3 or 4 for me.
Yeah.
Where we're talking about the mystical. We're talking about the tree of life. By the way, let's talk about Kurt Rosenwinkel too. But yes, it does appear that there's no. You have to search out the other forms of knowledge that are higher, because it doesn't appear to be in the schools whatsoever.
Same with faith.
Mm-hmm.
People don't teach the different hierarchies of faith in most places. And there are, according to one of my favorite authors, M. Scott Peck, there's only 4 levels of faith development. The first is the chaotic antisocial. These are sociopaths who use religion as a cover for doing terrible, evil things. Second is the people who are really only concerned with the facts or the rituals, what you're supposed to do in Judaism, what you're supposed to eat and not eat more than anything else. The third level are the skeptic individuals, people who question, take science seriously, don't just take it on face value. I think these are very interesting people. I'm scared of the level 1. Level 2, frankly, bore me. Level 3 are very interesting. I'm level 3, but occasionally you do get to that 4th level of mystical communal. At least we hope so. My job as a rabbi, it's very simple, is to help people on level 3, including myself sometimes, get to level 4. Saturday night, we had a service pretty late at night to sort of kick in the whole High Holy Day experience. And at one point, I was singing a song from a psalm that we read this time of year, Psalm 27, and I had a congregant play a saxophone. And something about that saxophone, plaintive saxophone, just pierced people's souls.
Wow.
Can't explain it. I can't tell you the notes made it happen, right? It's not that, but it worked. And that was a mystical moment.
Is this a musician who plays in town? Do we know him?
He's an amateur. He
Okay.
just, in fact, we have a little band, our synagogue band, and I never got him to play. And I asked him to play Saturday night.
Oh, cool.
And he said yes, and it was great.
It's awesome.
Well, there's definitely extraordinary power in music. And you talk about the science too. I mean, once we actually understood the vibratory, cymatic effects of music, it's like, whoa, this stuff is crazy.
And it doesn't happen online.
Right.
It doesn't work. But by the way, pews are better than seats in a church, because pews, without the separations, it's part of it. People will feel the music more than if you're in separate seats.
I like that. One thing I wanted to say is I really want to respect your time frame, and we are about to be there.
Yeah.
So I don't want to hold
It's getting so good, though.
No,
I know.
I'm enjoying this too. This is like the old salons of France. So, people would gather and talk about ideas. We don't do that enough.
You have definitely been one of our greatest guests, I would say, because you just have so much information and so easy to speak with. Is there anything that you want to leave with? Do you want to send a message out?
Sure. My favorite quote of all time is not from a Jewish person, but I did learn it from a rabbi. And this is the quote. It's from E.B. White, who's known for writing a number of children's books, but he was also, for many decades, a writer and essayist in the New Yorker magazine. And in fact, I think his wife's husband, not his father, was the editor of the magazine for decades. Anyway, when he was retiring from the New Yorker, he was asked by the New York Times, so this is around 1970, what is your philosophy that has guided you in life? And he said, if life were merely easy, that would be one thing. If it were merely seductive, that would be something else. But I awake every day, torn between a desire to savor the world or save the world. And it makes it hard to plan the day.
Wow.
That's real.
2,000 years ago, a sage, I believe was Jesus' teacher, but I can't prove that either, said something very similar. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? And I think those questions are what should guide us. It's not the answer so much. It's the following the right questions. And to me, that's it.
Yeah.
How do you plan your day?
Right.
I feel like you just put into words maybe something, because I've heard these quotes actually as well, but not the first one that you said.
Right.
Second one. But I feel like you just put into words something that we're always trying to communicate here on the podcast.
That's what we're trying to do with our podcast.
And trying to do in life.
Yes.
Even through music.
Right.
Music is definitely, there's as one of our other good friends said the other night, it's kind of like there's this sort of life answer when you're really in the music or you're part of the music.
You're in the zone, or you're in that flow.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So
It's
true.
this very interesting place. But everybody who's watching, this has been Rabbi Edwin Goldberg. Thank you so much
Pleasure.
for
Thank you.
coming, Rabbi Goldberg. This has really been an amazing episode. So much information. And real quick, let's put in, let's start with right here, Rabbi Edwin Goldberg. Now we might take out the rabbi part and just go with your name as well, but I just wanted to
Sounds
see
good.
that. We're getting 157s, 94s, 125s. Okay. Well, we'll look into it.
Look at it.
Let me know. That's great.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank
and
you.
we will do it again.